How was Axis artillery neutralised in support of Operation Lightfoot? We look at the counter-battery battle during 2nd Alamein.
This is the Principles of War podcast, professional military education for junior officers and senior NCOs.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to episode 90 of the Principles of War podcast. Today we're going to be continuing our look at the artillery command and control and the artillery battle for Operation Lightfoot. This is the breakout in 2nd Alamein. Predominantly, we're looking at the support that the 9th Division was given. 9th Division was given a series of quite difficult tactical tasks as the breakout evolved, and Montgomery changed his plan for the breakout. Some of the tactical tasks that 9th Division was given, it wasn't able to achieve. What it did do at the operational level was it degraded the fighting power that the Panzer Army Africa was able to generate. It forced Rommel to commit reserves. It forced Rommel to use very precious petrol and ammunition that he didn't have in great supply. The main effort for the Panzer Army Africa was defeating 9th Division as it threatened their lines of retreat. The casualties that 9th Div inflicted set the conditions for Op Supercharge, which was the second phase of 2nd Alamein. One of the key lessons to come out of 2nd Alamein is the flexibility that artillery brings to the battlefield. As the plan evolved, as it didn't go to the way that Montgomery was looking to, he was able to influence the battle by increasing the amount of artillery that was allocated to 9th Division and its battles. So we'll be looking at the way that the support to 9th Division was able to increase as the severity of the action that it was involved in increased, and more importantly, the impact that that had on the battle and how it supported 9th Division in defeating the 3 divisions that it had brought onto its front. Before we get into that, we want to look at some of the tactical tasks that the survey troops were doing. Now, this is in the lead up to the big counter-battery fires as the preliminary fires for Operation Lightfoot. Remembering that almost all of the Australian survey troops had been sent home at this point. So this will be Royal Artillery, British gunners, survey troops who are going to be supporting 9th Division as a part of 30th Corps as they build their counter-battery fires plan. Montgomery, in his planning for 2nd Alamein, had Brigadier Sidney Kirkman as the Brigadier Royal Artillery. That was his principal artillery advisor, and Shelford Bidwell wrote that it was Kirkman who turned Montgomery, an infantryman, into a gunner. Remember, Montgomery had significant experience in World War I. He understood the impact that artillery had on the battlefield, and he knew the importance of it and the way that it would save lives and set the conditions for success. One of the big differences that we see between 1st Alamein and 2nd Alamein is a return to the principles for the employment of artillery as they had been in 1918, where there were extremely well-developed ways of coordinating artillery and creating the effect that was required for an attack. One of those changes was the power and command and control capabilities that was given to the CBO. This is the Counter-Battery Office. The CCBO is the Corps Counter-Battery Office, responsible for 2 key tasks: the development of the hostile batteries lists and the plan to neutralise all of those batteries. To develop the plan, they had a range of inputs. There was flash spotting, sound ranging, OPs, shell wraps, which is a shelling report, and photo reconnaissance. Photos taken by planes flying behind enemy lines would then go to the APIS, which is the Air Photo Interpretation section, and the information seen in those photos would be analysed and updated, fed into the hostile battery list. The hostile shelling report form, I'll include a copy of this in the show notes. A simple form that would be filled in by any friendly troops receiving enemy fire. It's got 10 columns. Who is actually making the report, their location, the bearing to whether they saw the flash or the sound from the firing of the enemy artillery, what time from until the barrage occurred, the area shelled, the amount of damage that was done, Then the number of rounds and the type of fire. Was it a regimental fire mission? Was it just harassing fire? The number, type and caliber of the guns that were firing. And this would often be done with crater analysis. You'd be able to get a much better idea of the bearing to the firing battery, as well as the size of the guns that were firing. And then remarks like the flashbang interval. So how long between seeing the guns fire to the sound of those guns firing, because that's very easy to calculate the distance from the target to the firing battery. All of that information can be really important when that's fed into the counter battery office. In July 1942, 8th Army had gone static. So this is around the time of First Alamein. The Corps Counter Battery Office started to compile a hostile battery list, and the troops from the 4th Survey Regiment established 2 sections for flash spotting and 2 for sound ranging. And these bases were set out from the coast all the way down to the Katara Depression. So that was a 48-kilometre distance, and to connect all of those into the counter battery headquarters required 480 kilometres of cable. For the flash spotting section, the Royal Engineers erected 4 towers, which were initially 18 metres high and eventually 24 metres. From the top of the tower, the troops would be able to observe a hostile battery when it was firing. They'd use optical instruments to take a very accurate bearing. When a hostile battery firing was seen by 2 flash spotting sections, those bearings would intersect on the map. That was the location of the hostile battery. Now, to get it accurate enough to be able to fire on, you needed to accurately know the location of the flash spotting section of their tower. This was the role of the Royal Engineers survey troops. They would survey in the location of the flash spotting and the sound ranging troops to within 1 metre. That's not a simple task when you're in the desert and before the time of GPS. For the sound ranging, 6 microphone bases were established, and these were accurate out to 14,000 metres. One of the key roles of the flash spotting and sound ranging troops was in calibration of the guns. When a gun started firing with a new barrel, the barrel would inevitably start to see some wear and tear, and that wear and tear would allow more of the gas that rapidly burnt from the propellant to escape around the shell. This would decrease the pressure, and that would decrease the range of the gun. It was really important to have an accurate muzzle velocity for each of the shells that were fired. So calibration shoots would be done for every gun to determine the amount of wear in the barrel and what the muzzle velocity would be of the round leaving it. The more accurately the muzzle velocity, or MV, was calculated, the more accurately the gun would be able to fire. How important is this? Well, the actual amount of barrel wear that occurred during Second Alamein was so high that calibration shoots were required to be done every 3 days. One of the other critical roles performed by the gunners of the 4th Survey Regiment, that's actually the 4th Durham Survey Regiment Territorial Artillery. One of the other roles that they performed was the conduct of MET. So that they would, every 2 hours, send out a MET message which had the current weather conditions, including the temperature, barometric pressure, and the wind speed at various altitudes. This was used by each of the regiments to conduct corrections of the moment so that the rounds would be a lot more accurate. A considerable amount of work was required to collect this information and then disseminate it out to each of the regiments and then the batteries that would be firing. And this was done every 2 hours because the MET information had to be accurate if the fires were going to be accurate. It's important to note that the infantry also played an important role in the development of the accuracy of the hostile battery lists. On the front lines were the 9th and the neighbouring 51st Divisions, and they would send out infantry patrols to deliberately draw fire from enemy batteries. The sound rangers and flash spotters would be forewarned about the tactical activity, and they were able to gather better data and then compare that with the location reports that they had for the existing batteries. This would be compared with the air photos and reconnaissance reports. This allowed the much more accurate fixation of the hostile batteries to include their status, the accuracy of those batteries firing, the caliber, and the number. This is obviously a dangerous way of increasing the accuracy of the hostile battery list, but it highlights the importance of ensuring that all of the hostile batteries are listed and that it is as accurate as possible, so that when the active counter-battery phase begins, as many of the batteries can be neutralised for as long as possible. Right up until just before H hour, Brigadier Kirkman instituted a silent counter-battery policy. He wrote that the enemy was believed to have in action 200 field guns, 40 medium guns, and 14 heavy guns, which could bear on the front of the main attack. It was necessary that the positions of these guns be known and that nothing should be done which might cause any of them to move at the last moment. Consequently, on the northern part of the front, for over 2 weeks prior to the attack, a silent counter-battery policy was adopted. Except for certain destructive shoots against a particularly active battery and neutralisation shoots against roving guns. Since it was impossible to neutralise all of the enemy guns during the attack, the policy of employing all available on counter-battery fire immediately prior to 0 hour was adopted. In 30th Corps, during this period, 25 known hostile batteries within range were really subjected to heavy concentrations of up to 20 to 1, and in no case less than 10 to 1, whilst during the attack, more normal concentrations were put down for short periods of time on selected batteries. As part of Kirkman's deception plan, there were some fires conducted against hostile batteries, but they deliberately aimed off so that the enemy think that the target would have been engaged and that there was no requirement for them to move. Kirkman would go on to say that even before the battle started, that the 8th Army Artillery had achieved moral superiority over the enemy artillery. This was a defensive battle that the Axis had been preparing for a significant amount of time. They were limited in the amount of movement that they could conduct by their logistics. They were also short of a lot of ammunition natures. However, they had a prodigious amount. In fact, Kirkman said that it was practically unlimited supply of 25-pounder ammunition, which they had captured from various previous battles. But Kirkman said that they rarely fired at night, whereas the 8th Army fired round the clock. We destroyed his flash spotting towers. He did not fire at ours, even though they were marked on captured maps. The Panzer Army Africa artillery knew the location of every battery on the front, yet rarely engaged any single battery for a prolonged period. For the counter-battery plan, it's important to remember that 8th Army was short in medium artillery and it had no heavy artillery regiments. So the Desert Air Force was going to be required to perform the long-range artillery strike function and to fight the depth battle and provide that long-range counter-battery work. To do this, Air Vice Marshal Conyngham had numbers 221 and 212 groups to harass the land forces along with medium and heavy bomber groups to ensure the coordination and cooperation between air and land forces. Montgomery had co-located Desert Air Force headquarters with 8th Army headquarters. This meant that strikes were better able to be coordinated, and it meant that the information coming from the photo reconnaissance elements was within the hands of the counter-battery staff within 5 hours of aircraft returning, and this had come down from 36 hours prior to that. At this point, everything was ready. The hostile batteries had been located as accurately as could possibly be done. The bearing, elevation, and charge for each of the 882 field and medium guns had been calculated. That calculation included the location of that gun, the location of the hostile battery, the temperature of the charge bags, the muzzle velocity of each of those 882 guns, along with the current meteorological conditions, including wind speed. Royal Artillery Bombardier Challoner wrote, "Men stood at their stations, strained and silent, as they waited for the two words that would trigger off the Holocaust. Take post. And then a further 3 minutes of quivering tension had to elapse before the synchronized command rapped from 1,000 throats. Fire. In an instant, at the stroke of 2140 hours, flashes from hundreds of guns were seen sparkling in the long line across the desert. 30th Corps' front was approximately 7 miles, and there were 432 field guns and 46 medium guns that opened fire." Bombardier Challoner described that moment. "No fury of sound has ever assailed our ears like that before. It cuffed, shattered, and distorted the senses and loosened the bows alarmingly. I was more than startled, I was shocked, and needed to know that everyone else was there. When I could focus, the faces I saw first looked blanched and then flushed brilliantly in a kaleidoscope of passionately flickering hues as every line and detail was etched into relief by the flashes from the muzzles of the guns. Hundreds of guns, almost hub to hub, all bucking, recoiling, spitting fire and snapping like a pack of vicious terriers, all at once. It was sheer horror. The constant drill by which our army life had been ruled was now our saving grace, and even before the initial shock had been fully absorbed, we fell into the routine of performing all our tasks automatically. Bombardier David Goodhart of the 2nd 7th Field Regiment writes in a similar vein, "We stand with shaded torches, intent on the seconds of the last minute ticking around the dial of our lighted watches. 10 seconds to go. There is a soundless flickering all along the skyline south of us. Fire! The synchronization is an artilleryman's dream. It is sublime. The light leaps yellow, vicious, blinding. Even as we give ourselves up to the cordite, stinking, flaming world that has become so familiar to us after 3.5 months of night firing at Alamein, even as, tensing our feet against the familiar blast and noise, we bend to our tasks in the gun pits. We cannot help but realise that we are participating in one of the major moments in history. Then we lose the finer touch of speculation in the gross reality of hard labour." The initial counter-battery fires serials would run for 15 minutes. After that, the guns fell silent. As the active phase of the counter-battery battle commenced, Desert Air Force Wellington and Albemarle medium bombers illuminated the enemy territory with flares, bombed gun positions and troop concentrations, dropped dummy parachutists and jam radios to mislead and confuse the enemy response. And during the night fighters would bomb or strafe enemy gun flashes and lay smoke screens to continue the neutralisation effect on the enemy artillery. German war diaries recorded that casualties were only moderate. In fact, many of the guns remained intact. However, what it did achieve was significant degradation of Axis command and control. It was obvious that this was the commencement of the long-awaited offensive. However, there were minimal counter-battery fires from the German and Italian batteries, nor were there fires on the troops as they were crossing the line of departure for the assault. This is an excellent result from the counter-battery fires, and that effect would last for most of the night of the 23rd, 24th of October. It would be hours before the Axis artillery tried to reassert itself by firing counter-battery missions on known Allied battery positions, but by that time, those batteries had already moved. Most of the advancing troops received minimal fires overnight. However, this was to be the peak of the counter-battery battle for the Allies. Creating an effective counter-battery plan is a lot easier when the front line is static. Once movement starts, it's a lot more difficult because the flash spotting, the sound ranging, and the regiments themselves all need to be moving forward to keep pace with the advancing troops. Much of the counter-battery work would now become reactive, and as a consequence of that, casualties to troops would increase. Axis batteries would be withdrawing, they would be moving to new positions, and often it wasn't until they opened fire again that their location would become known. The gunners were given 5 minutes reprieve, during which they could catch their breath and lay on the first target of the first serial of the fire plan designed to support the infantry and the armour as they crossed the line of departure in Op Lightfoot. At 2200, 2 searchlights that had been pointing vertically up turned inwards and crossed. That was the signal for the commencement of Op Lightfoot. The official history writes, "At that instant, the British guns opened a barrage of unimaginable intensity, eclipsing their first performance, and to the urgent drumming of the guns, the infantrymen stepped out from their start lines in slow, measured paces. A continuous stream of glowing tracer shells in seeming slow motion, sailed over the heads of the advancing Australians and pointed to the direction of their attack. That was tracer fire from the anti-aircraft guns. They were highlighting the axis of advance so that everyone was able to go in the right direction. This is critically important when you're following narrow lanes that have been cleared by the engineers. The intensity of the barrage for the fire plan was such that for the rest of the war within the British Army, the term Alamein barrage was known as a barrage of particular ferocity. This fire plan was of critical importance to the success for Operation Lightfoot. The fire plan would ensure that the infantry and armour had the best chance possible to achieve their first night objectives. This was in many respects the most important part of the operation because troops would be attempting the break-in through the Devil's Garden, the huge minefield that Rommel had planned to slow them up. Rommel thought that the attack would come on this night because of the fact that it required a full moon to be able to get through the minefield. The objective of the minefield was to fix the troops in place so that they could be destroyed in detail by artillery during daylight. Remembering, of course, that it's important to ensure that obstacles are covered by observation and by fires. So how exactly was this fire plan developed? Brigadier Ramsay, the Commander Royal Artillery of the 9th Division, had spent a lot of time building his headquarters staff in their capability and their drills so that they were capable of producing fire plans very efficiently. The complexity of artillery command and control can be highlighted by the fact that there were multiple tasks under different commanders. Ramsay was responsible for the fire plan that was going to support the 9th Division's advance, but many of those guns were also going to be firing in the counter-battery plan. There was a temporal delineation in tasks, so from 2140 through to 2155, the counter-battery fire plan would be in effect. Then many of those guns would come back under control of Headquarters RAA 9th Division to commence the fires for the fire plan. The 9th Divisional RAA Headquarters staff were taking the scheme of manoeuvre as developed by the Divisional Commander, Morshead, and then overlaying a fire support plan. To work out the location of the targets, they were using aerial photography. They were able to quickly and efficiently identify targets and locate them accurately enough to be able to conduct fires on those positions. All of those targets would then be put into a timed schedule, which would then be sent out to the batteries, waiting for the final meteorological data to come in, at which point the firing data would be then calculated and issued out to the guns. The fact that they were waiting for the latest meteorological data to come out meant that there was a lot of work that needed to be done in a very short space of time, which was why a lot of practice had gone into developing the skills within the battery command posts to be able to generate that firing data quickly enough. By the 20th of October, the list of targets had already been compiled. They were models of precision and clarity. Ramsay provided the framework, and his Brigade Major Royal Artillery, Hilton Williams, filled in the detail, which Ramsay then checked meticulously. The process was streamlined to provide increased efficiency during the battle, to the point that 30th Corps CBSO noted with some annoyance that Headquarters RAA 9th Division did not use the proper channels for the request, interpretation and distribution of air photos. Williams found it much more efficient to bypass the system. One of the factors that led to the success of the headquarters planning was that the key staff were all experienced ex-militia regimental officers who had staff experience at regimental level. The officers in the headquarters were supported by signallers, drivers and clerks who had draftsman skills, and they were able to construct the traces and overlays that were required. Once again, it wasn't just the aerial reconnaissance that was used for the planning. There was also infantry and engineer reconnaissance that was conducted, because not only did they need to know the location of the defensive positions that the Axis had constructed, but also they needed to understand the location of the minefields that they faced. The extent to which the fidelity of the enemy defensive positions and obstacles was understood meant that widespread creeping barrages weren't required. Some targets could be engaged as point targets, leaving just the minefields and depth positions to be treated with a creeping barrage. It was noted after the battle by the Germans that the Devil's Garden that Rommel had planned did not have the desired effect because many of the mines had been detonated by artillery fire or during bombing attacks. The effect of the time barrages degraded the effects on the mines. Now, this isn't a terribly efficient way of clearing lanes, but it certainly decreased the casualties, and more importantly, it decreased the time for the infantry to clear those obstacles. The first day's attack saw 80% of the objectives being obtained. The major issue was with the armoured force. 10th Corps had struggled to understand the imperative to attack, but there were also command and control issues because it was 10th Corps armoured divisions that were supporting 30th Corps infantry divisions, and that created command and control issues. The fighting continued on the 25th, but the casualties were mounting within the Highland, South African and New Zealand divisions. Montgomery, in an effort to surprise the enemy, had the 9th Division swing north. They were just 6,000 metres away from the coast, and if they could achieve that breakthrough, they would cut off all of the Axis forces to the east of their salient. It was the 26th Brigade of the 9th Division that commenced this attack, and they succeeded brilliantly. They were supported by 7 field and 2 medium regiments. Here we see Montgomery utilising the flexibility of artillery. 9th Division only has 3 field regiments. They now have 3 times as many regiments in support of their move. Montgomery wants the 9th Division to become the main effort of the Panzer Army Africa. That will give the other divisions time to refit and prepare for their role in Operation Supercharge. He counterattacks with the 90th Light Division and he moves the 21st Panzer Division, which had been his operational reserve, from the southern front up to the northern front. Now, this is a critical move because it uses up a significant proportion of the fuel reserves that he has left. Rommel wrote of what happened to the 90th Light Division. A murderous British fire struck into our ranks and our attack was soon brought to a halt by an immensely powerful anti-tank defence, mainly from dug-in anti-tank guns and a large number of tanks. We suffered considerable losses and were obliged to withdraw. On the night of the 28th, the 20th Brigade from 9th Division attacks northwards. Ramsay at this point is given 13 field regiments and 3 medium regiments. He now has 360 guns to command in support of the 9th Division assault. To control this, each of the divisional artillery headquarters from the 2nd New Zealand, 51st Highland and 10th Armoured form a group under their own Commander Royal Artillery. The 3 medium regiments are grouped together under a Corps Commander Medium Artillery, but the fire plan will be prepared by Brigadier Ramsay. The German Panzer Army Battle Report of the attack on the 28th of October describes them as receiving the heaviest artillery fire that has ever been seen. The 20th Brigade at this point is close to exhaustion, and Mooreshead passes the 26th Brigade back through the 20th to maintain the pressure on the Panzer Army Africa. Here we see the incredible staff work of particularly the Brigade Major Royal Artillery of the 9th Division, Major Hilton Williams. Ramsay still has 360 guns supporting him, and a fire plan encompassing all of those guns is constructed and with the Infantry Brigade Commander by 1530 for a 0 hour of 2200. Not only is this fire plan complicated by the number of regiments that are supporting the brigade, but there is also the complexity of the scheme of manoeuvre. Some of the regiments are going to be firing at right angles to the axis of advance, and one of the regiments is actually firing directly into the direction of the advancing troops. Montgomery recognised the superior artillery planning that had gone into these attacks. It was these orders that Montgomery had circulated by GHQ Middle East to all of the British staff colleges as good example of operation orders produced and used with great success in actual operations. The attack, however, failed. Ground was taken, but also there were significant casualties. The objectives were probably overly ambitious, particularly given the state of 26th Brigade and the amount of fighting that it had already done. They consolidated their position in an area known as the Saucer. This is where we see the moral courage of Morshead and the superior training of the 9th Division. Morshead orders the 24th Brigade to conduct a relief in place with the 26th Brigade. So this is a relief in place at night in contact. This meant that on the morning of the 1st of November, instead of a brigade close to culmination, the Deutsche Afrika Korps assault met a fresh brigade, ready to conduct a vigorous defence of their position. Gunner Bert Lahore of the 2nd 12th Field Regiment wrote in his diary, "Our fire had been nearly continuous for several days as we called to ward off tank attacks and engage hostile batteries. Our OP was established on Bravo 11 and today was the object of a heavy attack. At 10 this morning, they sent an urgent call for defensive fire to be put down in front of the OP, which we did. The enemy retaliated by shelling the OP area mercilessly. Bombardier Bill Cutler was killed and the rest of the party had great difficulty in getting away from the position. Things are now very hot in this sector and it is touch and go." 14 anti-tank guns of the 2nd 3rd Anti-Tank Regiment were destroyed that morning. The remainder were redeployed in full daylight, only through the excellent courage and leadership of Lieutenant Walder and a lot of luck. That night, the 24th Brigade's tactical headquarters was shelled for 30 minutes. Major Copeland was killed, and the brigade commander, Brigadier Godfrey, was mortally wounded, as was Major Trenwith of the 2nd 12th Field Regiment. Despite not achieving the tactical success of reaching the coast, the 9th Division had achieved an operational success. They had forced Rommel to commit his reserve, which they had then defeated in detail. He had also expended the last vestige of tactical mobility that he had in the fuel that he had used in moving the 21st Panzer to the north. This meant that if he was to avoid the complete destruction of the Deutsche Afrika Korps, he would have to withdraw. And this withdrawal would be conducted against Hitler's orders. The success of the 9th Division in defeating these Afrika Korps attacks was partially due to the accuracy and responsiveness of the artillery in response to defensive calls for fires. Not only were the guns fast and accurate, but there was overwhelming firepower that could be brought to bear very quickly. This is due to Ramsay's use of the stonk, or the standard concentration. Given the newfound ability to centralise command of the artillery at the divisional level, he was able to bring to bear the fire of all 96 guns of the division, often augmented by the 4.5-inch and 5.5-inch guns of 7th Medium Regiment. The stonk was used particularly when tank attacks threatened the infantry. The stonk was a divisional target of between 400 and 500 yards long, and the zone of the guns would give them about 100 yards of depth. Before each phase of the battle, Ramsay and his staff would determine likely required defensive fires or SOS missions. This meant that as Morshead was briefing his brigade commander on the tasks ahead, Ramsay was able to provide them with overlays highlighting the locations where they would be able to bring down quick and effective defensive fires. Command post drills ensured that the speed of delivery of fire in response to stonks improved over the battle. The 14th Battery of the 2nd 7th Regiment devised a drill which produced predicted fire in minutes. Its best time from the moment RHQ advised them of coordinates to shot was 2 minutes. This is very impressive when you consider the fact that they only had slide rules to help them with the logarithmic calculations that they needed to conduct to calculate the bearing and elevation for the guns to be able to fire on those locations. One of the critical lessons for the Allies at Alamein was that infantry, unsupported by armour, could still gain their objective without undue casualties if covered by really heavy concentrations of artillery fire. I think it's important at this point to mention the incredible amount of trust that needs to exist between the artillery, between the gunners, and the troops of the supported arm, in this case, 9th Division. Particularly important when you consider the amount of high explosives that is travelling over their heads on its way to the enemy. Any mistakes in the calculations of the orders for the guns or in the laying of those guns can result in friendly fire casualties, and hence the colloquial infantry name for gunners of drop shorts. As we mentioned earlier, one of the things that can cause a decrease in the range of a gun, and if you're firing over the head of troops, that means that the round is going to drop short. One of the things that can cause that is a decrease in muzzle velocity, particularly when the guns are firing a lot. All of the regiments made a big effort to ensure that the guns were correctly calibrated with the right muzzle velocity, even during the high rates of fire that were conducted. However, during 2nd Alamein, there were a significant number of accounts where 25-pounder rounds were falling into the forward defensive lines of the friendly troops. How could this be? Well, it was actually part of a clever German ruse. They had a large number of captured 25-pounders, and when they saw an observation post officer registering a defensive fire task, so they would fire on that location so that they would have the correct firing data for it so that they could quickly re-engage the target if they needed to. When the Germans observed that, they would then silently register the location. They would add the distance that they thought would put the rounds into where the infantry would be located. This meant that when an 8th Army unit fired a defensive fire task, the German artillery would follow suit. German rounds would fall on the Allied infantry, and there would be a distinctive 25-pounder burst, and it would be labelled a drop short by the infantry. This would undermine trust and make them more likely to push their defensive fire tasks out further, making them less effective. Effective crater analysis of one of these missions highlighted the ruse when it was discovered that the base of the shell had been stamped with the imprint of German ordnance manufacturer Krupp. With that clever German ruse, we will leave this episode there and we will come back for the last episode of the employment of artillery at 2nd Alamein next week.
The Principles of War podcast is brought to you by James Ealing. The show notes for the Principles of War podcast are available at www.theprinciplesofwar.com for maps, photos and other information that didn't make it into the podcast. Follow us on Facebook or tweet us at Surprise Podcast. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please leave a review on iTunes and tag a mate in on one of our episodes. All opinions expressed by individuals are those of those individuals and not of any organisation.